thanks a million for having me. I'm from Donegal, as you might tell by my accent, and delighted to be here to talk to you today. Tough act to follow. The first two speakers, they were brilliant. I really enjoyed them. Yeah, a small bit of overlap there probably will be, but it's all interesting stuff. I kind of feel I'm probably the least qualified person to speak about this kind of stuff, because I know that Frank has been to the top of Mount Everest, and I know that Ian has been to the bottom. So, and I'm delighted to hear that Ruth hasn't been over there either. So I think, I felt a little bit better there about that. My mountaineering career was 2 trips up Croagh Patrick and Mount Errigal, so that's where it began and that's where it ended, you know. That's as much as I've done. But I have a huge fascination with this. It really stemmed from a radio documentary that I produced, oh God, when was it now? Last year or the year before, on George Mallory and Everest, but very much the Irish connection to it through the figure of Dr. Richard Hingston from Passage West in County Cork, who I'll talk a little bit about later on. It's an amazing picture. I love this picture. It's the north face of Mount Everest, and I've entitled the talk 29,000 feet above the sea. Now, I'm sure you all know, anyone that has an interest in Mount Everest knows that that's an incorrect measurement of how high it actually is. You know, it's slightly bigger. But I use that quotation because there was a fantastic radio documentary, not a radio documentary, sorry, a television documentary, I think went out on the BBC in the 1980s when, yeah, early 1980s, I think, when Captain Noel, who Ian mentioned, he's interviewed in it. There's 2 of the survivors who I'll talk about in this talk of the ill-fated 1924 expedition to Mount Everest, Captain Noel and Noel O'Dell, you know, Professor O'Dell of Cambridge University. And in it, there's a quotation which I thought was just really powerful, where Captain Noel, you know, really elderly in his late 80s, I think, you know, in the documentary, and he says, you know, Mallory and Irvine, they were 29,000 feet above the sea. They had to make it home by night. They never did, you know. So I thought that was kind of powerful, the way that he remembered it. So that's the north face of Mount Everest, and pretty impressive. And here then is the Wrong Book Monastery, which was touched on earlier. This is the 3rd time I've given this talk, and I just give a small bit of context, which has been touched on already, but I'll just touch on it again as well. It's kind of a political and geographical conundrum for the reasons that Ian there outlined, you know, Mount Everest, because it straddles the border, and you can see it there between China/Tibet and then the Nepalese side, and the summit point actually runs along the border. So there's 2 approaches to climb the mountain, really, I suppose, that are the most well known, from the north side in Tibet and the south side in Nepal, and obviously both close to outsiders at various different stages. That's the north face of Mount Everest, the more difficult to climb. Now, I can't say that with any validity, but maybe Frank could be able to elaborate on that maybe a bit after me. But it's said to have been, I'm sure, you know, on the south side going over the Khumbu Icefall isn't exactly a doddle either, like a stroll in the park. But they say this is slightly more difficult to climb, and it was the focus of the 3 early expeditions in 21, 22 and 24, because that was the only way they could get in, you know. Tibet was closed to foreigners and outsiders. So the 3 main obstacles there are where am I now with my pointer? There we go. The 1st, 2nd and 3rd step, which are along this ridge here, and some pictures of them in a second I'll show you. And Kumulungma, which is the Chinese name, and Chumulungma, which it translates to Mother Goddess of the Earth. You know, so this is it's a spiritual mountain. It's a very important place to the native people. You know, and to stand on the summit is standing on the head of the god. Do you know? So that's how important it is. The south face, I love this picture here. It looks like a fang, I think. And I think there was a quotation, Mallory, you know, on first seeing it, said Everest was like, it was like a fang excrescent from the jaw of the world, you know? And when you see that image of the mountain there, it really comes into play of what he might have saw. The main obstacle is obviously the Khumbu Icefall, which was, you know, first successfully navigated by Hillary and Tenzing in 1953, and that was the first site to be, you know, recognised as the first ascent. We'll talk a bit more about the controversy with the Mallory and Irvine climb a little bit later, and that's known as Sagarmatha, Skyhead to the Nepalese people. So there's Everest again, just briefly again, the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, and they actually believed that Kachinjunga was the highest peak in the world, and you know, they knew that there was this bigger mountain that was seen then, and eventually it's measured. The raw data suggested an average height of 9,200 meters. That was out now. That was out a slight bit because of light refraction, which distorted heights. It went on to be obviously named after Everest, or Everest as he was known. Peak 15 by the British, and then the gentleman, the Indian mathematician that Ian had up earlier, and they calculated it 29,000 feet, 8,839 metres, and the actual height is 29,029 feet, 8,848 metres. And again, obviously, 1865, renamed Mount Everest after Waugh's mentor, George Everest. So just a little bit about Captain Noel. He's an interesting guy. This is him from his, there's a fantastic book that he wrote called, and I suggest if anyone is interested in this period to go and read it. It's a fantastic primary source account written by Captain Noel through Tibet to Everest. It's a fantastic book. And I tracked down a copy of it. It was hard to find actually, but I got a copy of it in a second-hand bookshop. I was delighted to get it. He actually travelled over, as Ian alluded to there, in 1909, commissioned into the East Yorkshire Regiment and posted to India. The battalion spent summers near the Himalayas, and in 1939, he gets into his disguise here and he travels, and he gets within 40 miles or whatever it was, whatever the distance is, of Mount Everest, and he encounters some people that he doesn't want to upset anymore, and he turns around, you know. But he comes back anyway to the Royal Geographical Society, and he gives a lecture in 1919. You know, so there would have been like Captain Scott gave lectures there, all the explorers give lectures, and you know, Noel had actually seen Captain Scott give a lecture there on about one of his polar expeditions before he tragically died. So Noel gives this lecture here, and it generates interest in Everest, you know, and they request permission to explore it. And, you know, through the arms deal, etc., permission is granted. So the Alpine Club comes together with the Royal Geographical Society, and they form the Mount Everest Committee to organise and finance the expedition. And the chair was Sir Francis Younghusband. And that's the guys there, as I say, with the George Bernard Shaw line of the picnic in Connemara, it's a picnic in Connemara, which I think looks like it was interrupted by a snowstorm, to be quite honest. But there's some of the members, again, briefly. Charles Howard Bury, Bullock, Kellis, George Mallory, who's, you know, the main guy I'm going to talk about, and that's one of the pictures they took as well. You know, I mean, as an expedition, it was a complete and utter success because it achieved everything it set out to do. Mapped the mountain. It was a complete success. And that's Charles Howard Bury there. You've heard plenty about him, but I'll just tell you that George Mallory didn't like him. You know, so just he didn't like him at all. The two of them, they just did not get on. Mallory actually, he said he was typical of the Irish landlord class. Now, Mallory was a bit of a socialist. He was a left-wing kind of a thinker. Mallory was a member of the Fabians, the Socialist Society. He was also, you know, I suppose he kind of favoured the underdog in a lot of ways. But Bury and him didn't get on. I think another reason that they didn't get on, apart from the politics and the side of things as well, Mallory was a huge sympathiser with like Irish independence and, well, mainly Home Rule and then kind of independence. Well, I'll talk about that in a bit. But another thing was that like Bury was just like really organised, a soldier, a really top guy, and Mallory was a scatterbrain. Like he was just like, you know, he actually went up with a camera to take photographs, you know, during the expedition, on the 21 reconnaissance expedition, and realised that he had the frames in the wrong way, like, you know, in the camera, and took all these pictures that just turned out to be useless after climbing up really high. So you can imagine how someone who with a military background would have been infuriated by that, you know. He was kind of, Mallory was a technophobe, he was kind of like really scattered, he was kind of a free spirit, you know, which is the total opposite of a man who's a military guy. So they didn't really get on. This is Kellis. I just mentioned him as well. He was mentioned earlier. This is a picture of Kellis there. He discussed the physiology of acclimatization. And he was on that 21 expedition, like, and he believed that, you know, men of a certain constitution, a physical and mental constitution, they could climb Mount Everest, you know, without supplementary oxygen. And that point was proven in the 1980s. I think it was the 1980s, Frank, with Reinhold Messner, when Messner climbed it without supplemental oxygen. So, you know, Kellis's theory was proven eventually. Died of a heart attack in 1921 near Camp Zong. That Ian had some great pictures of that kind of fortress, you know, near that area. I mean, it was probably a pulmonary edema, because that seems to be pulmonary and cerebral edemas are things that affect people most at altitude, you know. So possibly could have been that. And they discovered the viable route of the North Col. So this brings us to George Mallory. That's a picture of him up in the Alps there. I actually listened to a really good talk recently, and you mentioned Edward Whymper, you know, so that Scrambles Amongst the Alps, you know, was a fantastic book. And Mallory would have read that and been very interested in it. And that's probably one of the most famous pictures of him there on the right-hand side. So a little bit about him. He was born in Mobberley in Cheshire, student at Winchester College, recruited by a teacher for an excursion to the Alps, and he had a strong natural ability for climbing. So I mean, in his lifetime, he became kind of box office when it came to climbing. He was a huge talent at it and well known for it. He graduated from Magdalen College in Cambridge. Initially, when I was making the documentary, I was butchering that and calling it Magdalen College, and I was corrected on it when I went over there, about the correct pronunciation. So it's Magdalen College, and taught at Charterhouse School. So like myself, he was a school teacher, which is why I think I kind of like him. I think he was an ordinary guy in so many ways, trying to do extraordinary things. Climbed in the Alps in the Lake District. My wife and I were actually recently over in Wales, and we went to the hotel in Penny Pass, which is class to see. So I kind of knocked on the door and I went in, because Mallory stayed there and Hilary and Tenzing, and I knocked on the door and they probably thought I was a right geek, because they were serving dinner, and I said, "Can I just come in and stand inside and have a look?" Do you know what I mean? So they were nice enough when they let me, but it's just at the base of Snowdon, which is where Mallory would have climbed and all that, and Hilary and Tenzing tested the gear. Now, Mallory served in the British Army, and during the First World War, he fought in the Somme. He was an artillery officer. And I mean, he saw huge bloodshed. There's a fantastic book written about this by, oh God, his name goes out of my head now. He's the Canadian anthropologist, Wade Davis, Into the Silence. And that goes into all the detail that Mallory and all these guys they went through and they suffered, and what they saw. And he's of the view, and I agree with him, that very much fermented in his mind about climbing Everest. It was more than just a technique, it was about showing humanity, could do something bold and brave, compared to the slaughter that he had seen. This isn't Mallory at all. This is Conor O'Brien, So Conor O'Brien was involved in the Howth gun running, and he was actually a mate of Mallory's, and they went climbing together in Ireland. So Mallory actually developed a bit of a fascination for Ireland post the First World War. Mallory, I suppose, because of the slaughter, and he and his wife Ruth were very much they were very much socialists. They were very much thinking, they became quite anti-war, and he saw what was going on in Ireland, and he kind of wanted to come over and see it for himself. But he had come on holidays. He had climbed with Conor O'Brien. They climbed the McGillicuddy Reeks. They climbed Mount Brandon, and his wife Ruth actually spent time in Marble Hill. And Mallory himself actually heard a speech given in Charterhouse School by a Home Rule MP for Donegal, Hugh Alexander Law, advocating kind of Home Rule for Ireland. He thought this is a perfect solution for Ireland. The people need self-government there. So he was very, very interested in Ireland and came here on several occasions. Now, while he got involved in the Howth gun running, Mallory thought there's a more diplomatic route. He got a job post-war in the League of Nations, and he decides to come to Ireland. He and O'Brien sail around, the Kelpie was the name of the boat that O'Brien had, and they sail around Valentia, Tralee, they visit Dingle. Obviously had a great time there, as everybody does, Climb Mount Brandon, and O'Brien was one of Mallory's companions. They used to go to Penny Pass, and there's a great photograph of them actually outside that hotel, the Penny Gurd Hotel in Penny Pass in North Wales. And they did a bit of climbing there. And O'Brien, he obviously had experience of being up Croagh Patrick. It sounds like it here. He climbed barefooted with a pipe in his mouth, so he must have been up there at some point. Now, there's a whole kind of intelligentsia here, and they're all kind of friendly with each other. And one of their friends is actually Desmond Fitzgerald, who's former Taoiseach Gareth Fitzgerald's father, obviously involved in the revolutionary period. And he senses a kind of he knew Mallory kind of, through various connections, and he sensed an opportunity here to get somebody in to kind of see what was going on with the War of Independence. And he actually writes, Mallory is anxious to have first-hand information as to acts of oppression and terror. I shall be glad if he can be assisted. So Mallory goes kind of at the height of the War of Independence on behalf of the League of Nations to observe what's going on and to see it for himself. And he writes as he comes back, well, before I read that, I'll just explain. He went over And he had a look around. He talks about being kind of terrified of, he walks around the streets of Dublin. He's terrified of taking his hands out of his pockets because, putting his hands into his pockets because he thinks that someone might, suspect he has a gun or something. He's actually staying in his hotel room and the Black and Tans break into the hotel and they ask him, are you a Catholic or a Protestant? And he's alleged to have said, it's like, dear boy, don't you know that Catholics and Protestants are both Sinn Féiners, And with his English accent, and he was the son of a vicar, they said, right, well, we'll let him go. He talks about like vicious beatings, but burning, arson, and just terrible looting and violence. And it reminds him of just the hardship that he saw in the Psalm, of just this sheer, I suppose, it's just a desperate scene, and it's encapsulated then fully for him when he's walking through the streets of Dublin, and down an alleyway he sees a child that has been killed in the crossfire lying in the alleyway, and he talks about it like haunting his dreams, that it upsets him so much. When he goes back to England, he tells Ruth, his wife, he said that he just cannot get this image of the child out of his mind, and it really disturbs him. There was a fantastic book written recently by a British historian, actually, which I thought was a fantastic idea. They wrote a biography of Ruth Mallory, which I think was a brilliant idea. And they go into detail about that, how he confided in her, how much it upset him. And it made him determined, to show humanity is capable of good things, and great things, I think more so. And he writes later, Mallory, there is wrong on both sides, but national aspirations, a passionate idealism, are to be found only on one side. It is to this fact that Irishmen appeal when they exclaim, if only people in England knew, if only they would come and see. They believe in the truth of their idealism, but how are they to project a message from this spirit to penetrate English apathy? They say to Englishmen, come and see. They believe that for Englishmen in general, to see would be enough, and it is enough. So he came to see for himself. Now, he returns to Everest in 1922. So as I say, they were determined to try and get up there and try and be the first to summit Mount Everest for various reasons. Mainly, I suppose, that third pole for the British to be the first to get up there. And the 1922 expedition is the first serious crack at trying to do this, So that's Mallory there on the left-hand side. And these are some of the other members of the expedition. Ian briefly mentioned there Colonel Bruce. That's Colonel Bruce in the middle here. So he was a real military man, serious operator, and a really, really good guy to take on that expedition. And here were some of the other expedition members. Now, on the left here, I'll talk about this guy. That's Captain Noel. So he's back again. He's out of disguise now, and he's back into the civvies. And here he is with a film camera. And he got the rights to actually film this expedition. And it's a film that you can watch today. You can Google it. It's on the British Film Archive website, the bfi.co.uk. Just look it up. It's called Climbing Mount Everest. It's a 45-minute silent film, and it is incredible to look at, considering when it was shot. There he is with his camera up at a high altitude, and he had the rights for all this, and the photographs and everything else. So that was Captain Noel. He was involved. And then obviously Brigadier Charles Bruce, Captain Geoffrey Bruce, who was his nephew, and there's a few, Mallory and the rest of the guys. Norton and Somerville are very important characters. I'll talk about them later. Wakefield, and then there's John Noel as well. And this guy is a big character as well, George Ingle Finch. He's a very cool guy indeed. That's him there on the left. Now, he had a hard time getting into the various expeditions because they didn't like him for various reasons. The guys involved in the Alpine Club, the Mount Everest Committee, they just didn't really take to Finch. They disliked him because he was divorced, but they really disliked him because he was Australian, unfortunately for him, and they just didn't seem to like that. I don't know why. Born on the 4th of August, 1888, and he dies in 1970. His son actually went on to be a famous film star. I can't remember his name. Yeah, Peter Finch was his son, But
his brother was the Out of Africa.
Oh yeah. Oh wow. No, he's really interesting, and the thing about him is they all laughed at him because he was an advocate. He was a scientist, so he was a very intelligent man, and he said you're going to need supplementary oxygen to make some sort of attempt on the mountain, and they laughed at him. I think one of the things that was said was oxygen is for rotters. Yeah, this is oxygen is for rotters, and another I think that was said. Only a complete rotter would use oxygen. And it was unsportsmanlike to use oxygen. So, and the other thing was he had this thermal jacket that he'd invented himself as well. So he was well protected while the rest of the guys were in their picnic gear. So he was well wrapped up in that. But he and Mallory are the two big. They're kind of like. It's a terrible example, but it was the best one I can think of is like the Messi and Ronaldo of climbing, they're the two big rivals, Now, which one, I suppose Mallory was the Messi figure, but these are that's what they were your two really famous climbers, and they were trying to outdo each other. Who would be the first to kind of do it, So that was his background. He was involved in it. He goes on the 22 expedition. He couldn't get onto the 21 expedition, I think, because they said that he wasn't up for it. Like, medically, they did a medical test in Harley Street, and then they let loads of lads on it that were in far worse nick than he was, like, basically, because it was just trying an excuse not to let him on it. But a really interesting guy. So there was 3 attempts made on the summit. Mallory, Norton and Somerville left Moorshead, one of the guys behind, suffering from frostbite, and they push on through to windy conditions to 27,000 feet, 8,230 metres, setting a world altitude record. And of course, Finch goes out then with his oxygen on him, and he's determined he's going to outdo that, and he gets up a bit higher. He gets up another 100 metres or so, 8,320 metres, and returned the same day. That's him and Geoffrey Bruce coming back there down the northeast ridge there to the top of the call. And as was alluded to earlier, on the 3rd attempt then there was an avalanche. Mallory, of course, you see, when Finch got that far, he said, well, I'll have a crack at it again, and I'll try and get up, even further. And I mean, this is an incredible height to get up to, by the way. This is world altitude record, I mean, it's a record in itself. But Mallory's determined to go even further, and on the 9th attempt, it was ill-advised. 9 Sherpas were swept over by an avalanche over an ice cliff, and 7 were killed. Mallory's party's carried down 150 feet, but they're not injured. So he's overcome with kind of remorse about this. And the guys in the expedition, I think it was Howard Somerville, actually, he talks about, it's a pity that not one of them wasn't killed, as well. They felt a lot of guilt that it was only the Sherpas that were killed, and they felt really bad about that. Mallory actually says he's done with climbing, but it doesn't last for very long. He's doing a lecture tour, actually, so, they did a series of lectures, and he travelled all around the world, giving lectures on this 1922 attempt. And like the 21 attempt, a really good book was made about it then by by Colonel Bruce, about the 1922 attempt and how they got on, basically. And Mallory is giving an interview in New York to the New York Times, actually, in 22 about this. And the famous quote comes from there: "Why climb Mount Everest?" The journalist asks, and he says, "Well, because it's there." So that's where it came on the lecture tour for that. And they can't get back in 1923, but they decide that they're going to try and get back there in 1924, and they assemble a new team. Mallory, I suppose, at this particular time is determined that he's going to be the person to climb Mount Everest and reach the summit for the first time, because the teaching career isn't working out the best for him. He gets a job, actually, as in the extramural department of Cambridge University, giving lectures to kind of adults in the evening. But he's not content, because he can live this huge life, traveling the world and giving lectures and being this big star. And he seems to be determined then to go and fulfill that ambition because of that. Famously, Colonel Norton, and I'll talk a little bit more about him. Colonel Norton on the expedition, his son, I think, was said to have said that he could turn back. He didn't have to go the whole way to the top, Colonel Norton, because he had his army career to go back to, whereas Mallory didn't. More about that in a second, but that's the expedition crew there as well. So a few familiar faces. I mean, there's Mallory, the only guy that's on all 3 expeditions, and that's Sandy Irvine. We'll talk about him in a second. Noel O'Dell, that's Teddy Norton there. See if I remember them all now. Howard Somerville, Geoffrey Bruce, and there's Bentley Beetham and Edward Shabir. So that was all the guys there. Now, there's a few guys on the expedition that aren't in the picture. Major Hingston, who we'll talk about as well, and then John Noel, obviously, with his camera. He comes back again, and he makes another film, an even longer film called The Epic of Everest, which is, again, available online. And I would advise anyone, that has an interest in that to go and watch that film made in 1924. I've watched it several times, and I just can't get over how advanced it is for 1924. It's incredible. And there's a very interesting, they've composed a new soundtrack to go along with it and everything. It's fantastic. So Noel comes again. Again, they have a deal with the newspapers, to broadcast or to, say back what's going on in the expedition and how successful they're being, or how they're getting on, So there's 3 attempts made on the summit in this expedition as well. June 1st, they come across the Tibetan Plateau. They kind of arrive there from various different places. Like Mallory and Irvine actually get the boat from Liverpool. Hingston is actually in Iraq, and he heads from there. Noel O'Dell is in the Middle East as well, and they all converge here, and they make their way to Tibet, across the Tibetan Plateau, and eventually then to the Rongbuk Valley, and they set up their base camp. And the first attempt is made. Now, they're under pressure here because the monsoon is going to come in soon, and there's going to be no climbing if it arrives. so they set up, the first attempt is to be Mallory and Bruce. That's Geoffrey Bruce now, not Captain Bruce. Captain Bruce isn't on the expedition anymore because on the way there he gets a serious bout of dysentery, he gets malaria, becomes quite ill, and Richard Hingston, the Irish doctor, actually sends him back home, and Teddy Norton, who's second in command, takes over as the head of the expedition. So they're without their leader, so they're hit by misfortune from the very beginning. Geoffrey Bruce and Mallory make the first attempt, and the Sherpas become exhausted. They have to stop and go back. And then the second attempt is made by Norton and Somerville. And with 3 Sherpas, they pitch a camp at Camp 6, 26,800 feet, 8,170 meters. Now, that's said to be a picture of it. I'm not sure that it is. I don't know exactly, but it comes from the Bentley Beetham collection, and it says that that's Camp 6, which is the highest camp that they had on that expedition, just before they would head up over the northeast ridge and away off to try and get up to the summit. And there's a bit of speculation that might actually be the 5th camp and not the 6th one. We don't really know. And the second attempt then, it comes on June 4th. So you have Teddy Norton and Howard Somerville, 2 really interesting characters. As I say, Norton was, he took over the expedition as its leader. He was a military man. Somerville was also in the military, but he was a doctor with a background as a doctor, and 2 serious mountaineers as well. Really, really interesting guys. And they get to 26,800 feet and set a camp at Camp 6, and they reach 28,000 feet the next day. Now, Norton gets the highest here. He gets to 28,100 feet, 8,565 meters. So he beats Finch's record of 2 years prior and sets the world altitude record that isn't surpassed until 1953 that we know of, okay? And there's a really famous picture here. I don't know if you can see it on the right-hand side, but that's actually Norton there. Can you see him? You can't really see him, but that little white thing's his backpack on him. That's Norton there. That's the summit. So that's him up here, I think approaching the 2nd step or just below it. He crested underneath it, yeah. That's Norton here, and that's Somerville. So on their attempt, the 2 of them are heading on up here. They're traversing along this just below the ridge. They were kind of trying to go up the face of the mountain, whereas Mallory wanted to go exactly along the ridge. He was a ridge walker. So they say. Again, there's a lot of conjecture, what routes people took and all this, because, it's not really a lot. There's a bit of conjecture, but Mallory has said they've gone along the ridge, and these guys definitely tried to go up up along the face and kind of go underneath some of the obstacles. So they get up a certain height. Now, Pearl Norton, he didn't have his snow goggles on him, so he got blinded by, he got snow blindness, and he was blinded by the snow, which is actually sunburned to the corneas, if I'm not mistaken. With the altitude here, Somerville, he begins retching and coughing the higher and higher he gets until it becomes just so bad. And he actually gets he takes this photograph here. He has the camera, and he takes the photograph of Norton. He tells Norton, I can't go any further. And he says to Norton, you go on. He doesn't tell him that he thinks he's going to die. He's so overcome with this coughing. And he sits down on a rock and thinks, this is it, my number's up. And he coughs, and eventually he coughs up this kind of blood and everything. And he's actually coughed up the larynx, lining of his larynx, which has become frostbitten. And he gets instant relief from it then. Norton goes the whole way up to here, but he sees that it's just so treacherous, and he knows that he wouldn't get to the top and back without putting himself and Somerville in danger. And he makes the sensible decision to turn back, Now his son, Christopher Norton, has written a book based on his father's experience. And I heard an interview that he gave. He said, well, my father had a career in the military. He had something to go back to, whereas Mallory, the mountain was everything, and he was obsessed. So Norton makes the decision to turn back. They pick up Somerville, and they manage to get their way down to the North Col, I don't know how, in terrible, terrible condition, where they're met by this guy, Richard Hingston, who had been below at base camp. And this is Hingston here from County Cork, from Passage West in Cork. The guys get down there, and Hingston, who'd never climbed a mountain in his life, right, actually gets up to the top of the North Col and takes the guys back down again, okay, and rescues them. And that's actually documented in the film. You can see actually like Hingston with Norton and Somerville carrying the 2 guys, like kind of, they've taken them back down to a safer altitude. it's been described as kind of similar to what Tom Crean did, you know, in that rescue that he did as well. It's on that level. It was incredibly brave what he did, and they put the two guys into a tent and for them to recover. And Norton is in the tent trying to recover. So just a little bit about Hingston, and I'll continue on then in a second. He was born in 1887, went to UCC, Indian Medical Service, and he wrote several books on natural history. And he was really interested in altitude, actually. So he kind of continued on what Kellis had, you know, initially been developing in terms of oxygen and all that, and you know, the effects of altitude on human beings at great heights. And he did tests on some of the guys on the expedition, and you know, I think that kind of annoyed them a little bit, you know. But Mallory actually really liked Hingston. He said, "It's a tremendous little party we have, and one of the best is Hingston, a quiet little Irishman," is what he called him. He grew up in a lovely house called Horsehead House, which is still there in Passage West. And just last month, actually, I gave this talk down there, and it was really nice to commemorate Richard Hingston in his hometown. And there's a great book on him, which I'd recommend that people check out, written by a local historian in Cork. So he was the medical officer, and a really interesting guy. His diaries, which are in Trinity College, are incredible. That's him actually there. That's another picture of the expedition. That's Hingston there with the rest of them. As you'll notice, Mallory and Irvine aren't in the picture. Just more about that in a second. But look at the drawings he has here, do you know, of insects, you know, of everything else. And some of the passages are incredible. Like, he talks about the mountains continually giving forth sounds, groaning underneath their feet. And he talks about, you know, Mallory and Irving making their climb. It's an incredible account. So it's really digitized. You can look at it on Trinity College Special Collections website. Two more members. This is Sandy Irvine and Noel O'Dell. They were on the expedition as well. He's wearing his rowing scarf. That's Sandy Irvine. He had no mountaineering experience whatsoever, but he was brought along because he was a genius in terms of mechanics. He's said to have designed a gear so a machine gun could fire through propellers, you know, on an airplane, and it was sent into the War Office, and this guy thought he was a genius. He actually went with Noel O'Dell on the Merton College Oxford expedition to Spitsbergen, and you know, he was kind of hardy on it, and they thought, this guy would be great, strong as an ox, he'll help us out, he'll have something to play, you know, he'll have a role to play at some point. So anyway, a third attempt, they decided to make this third attempt, and in the background in this tent, Norton is laying in this tent snowblind, trying to recover his eyesight. And this is, well, they say it's the last picture of Mallory and Irvine. It actually isn't, actually. There's a photograph, there's a long shot taken from miles away where there's two little dots in the film, which is actually, you know, the last shot of them heading up. This is Mallory here. Snow goggles on him, wrappings around here. You can see the gear he has on them. Sandy Irvine, they strap on their oxygen sets, by the way, here before they head off. Mallory has got over his aversion to oxygen, you know, so it's no longer for rotters, you know, when he has a shot at getting to the top. They had these upside down originally, and they were leaking, and Sandy Irvine, Andrew Irvine was his name. He comes up with the idea of putting them upside down, which actually works. So they strap them on like that, and you can reach back and work at the valve at the back of your hand there, and they don't seem to leak as much. And he has his ice axe and his snow goggles, and off they go, and that's it. Shinné, you know, end of the story. But they head on up. And actually, I'll just go back here. Noel O'Dell here. He decides to go after them and climb in support. All right. So you know, they'll get up to Camp 6. He'll be there at Camp 5. You know, making the tea when they come down. You know, that kind of a thing. So he's behind them, and that's the kind of the idea of it. So you know, a day goes by. There's no sign of them. And O'Dell gets to about here, and he's looking at the mountain. Down at the base camp, you actually have Richard Hingston, and he's there. They're looking through telescopes with the Sherpas, and they're trying to see if they can spot Mallory and Irvine. Mallory gets up to Camp 6, and he sends a note down with the Sherpas, telling Noel, who has his video camera pointed this way at a certain time, and you'll see me going up here, up along the ridge. It's the last note that's ever heard from him. And they get to this point here, and O'Dell is a geologist. Like, he loves rocks, and he's walking around, and he sees some fossils, and he's just overcome with like joy to see fossils this high on Mount Everest, and he's kind of having a big moment where he's really geeking out on those, and he looks up, and the next thing, there'd been mist all over Everest, you know, over the summit that particular morning, and the mist clears for a short period of time. And basically what happens is O'Dell's standing here, and he sees two figures along the ridge. One figure climbs up to what he believes is the second step. I'll show you a picture of this in a second so it makes more sense. The second step is like a huge obstacle here, and then you have the first step and then the third step. And if they were at the top of the second step, then more than likely we're going to get to the summit. It's about, I think about 300 vertical meters if you're on the top of that. That's now still a long time in climbing in altitude, but it's very close to get to the summit. So he sees one figure here and he sees another figure, just 2 dots, climbing up beside it, and he says that's Mallory and Irvine, and the mist comes in. So time goes by, you know, they're missing, and he gets up to their highest tent, Camp 6, and he sees like there's a compass there, which Mallory must have forgot. There's bits and pieces belonging to them, and he goes back down to Camp 5. He comes back up the next day. There's nothing there, you know. So, and you can't survive on the mountain, like, you know, overnight, like in the equipment. So they come to the conclusion that something must have happened to them, and he is given. There was a pre-arranged signal between O'Dell and Hinkston and the rest of the guys down at base camp, and Norton has recovered his eyesight, and basically he would lay a single sleeping bag out in the snow if he had found them and they were coming back down, or a cross to say that they had died. So Hinkston and all the guys are anxiously waiting at the base camp. They're looking up, and then Hinkston sees this cross, you know, and that they can't find them, they must be lost. And O'Dell is giving up and he's coming back down. So O'Dell actually, he's talked a lot, like, over the course of his life about, you know, he was going through a blizzard, like in snow and wind, trying to find them. It was incredibly brave. Now, people have called into question, what did he actually see? You know, I think Eric Shipton, the famous mountaineer, you know, he said that O'Dell wasn't acclimatized and he was hallucinating, you know. I've met Noel O'Dell's grandson, Peter. He's a lovely gentleman, and Peter says, no, my grandfather, he definitely saw them. Now, where he saw them is up for debate, but he definitely saw them. He wasn't hallucinating, seeing, you know, they thought he might have saw birds or rocks moving or something. His sighting is kind of called into question a little bit, because if they're on the first step, well, there's no way they got there. If they're on the second step, then they had the time to get up and back before nightfall, when it wasn't safe enough. They were way after the time that they'd set out for themselves to get to the summit, and you know, there was a huge danger that they probably didn't get there because of that, because of the time that they'd left. Now, Mallory, in his pocket, he'd carried a picture of his wife Ruth, and he promised to leave it on the summit. That was the whole thing. On the summit when he got there. And that's it. They come back. It's a huge tragedy. They build a memorial cairn, actually, and they build it for all the guys, you know, at the base camp that died, for Kellis, all the guys that had died on the expeditions, the Sherpas in 22. And they head back to England. There's a huge memorial service in St. Paul's, which was, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only time mountaineers had something dedicated to them at that level, you know, in Britain. Like a state thing where the king was there, and that's really it. You know, the next expedition goes in 1933, led by Hugh Rutledge, and they get up pretty high. Actually, they get up to this similar level along the ridge, and as they're going along to the base of the first step, a guy called Percy Wynne Harris, who was a mountaineer, he looks down and he sees an ice axe on the ground. And they continue further on, and they go towards the second step, and they see the second step, and he compares it to like the bow of a ship, and he says, there's no way anyone got up that, all right? And he comes back, and they give up, and they don't go any further. They traverse back, and Wynne Harris puts his own ice axe down to mark the site, and he takes this other ice axe with him, and he takes it back then, and they get back down, and they go back to England, and they notice that there's 2 nicks on it. And then they come up with the conclusion that Irvine might have put nicks all along his climbing gear, so it must be Sandy Irvine's ice axe. Now there's a theory that it's Mallory's ice axe. You get into the realm of conspiracy theories and all that crack. But on the same expedition, or it could be the 35 one, there was one again in 35. I think it was the 33 one. There was a guy, Frank Smythe, and he's looking through a telescope, and he actually sees what he thinks is a body right below the ice axe, and he thinks, God, that could be Mallory or Irvine. And he doesn't say anything about it because he doesn't want to create controversy. And that actual information didn't come out until a few years ago, until his son released a book that his father had written. And there's not really much more about it. There's subsequent expeditions, you know, 33, there's one in 38, which was, they don't even get to the North Col in it, you know what I mean, because of weather conditions. Nothing during the war, and then there's the 51, 52, and then eventually in 1953, I'll just go briefly there and back, Hillary and Tenzing reached the summit, and that's Tenzing on the top there. There's no picture of Edmund Hillary on the top of Everest, and there's a great quote. I love Edmund Hillary. I think he's class. If you read any of his books, they're all brilliant. And in one of his books, High Adventure, he said, yeah, he said, Tenzing didn't know how to use a camera, and I don't think the top of Mount Everest was the place to start to show him, you know? So that's the reason there's no picture of Edmund Hillary. So Hillary was steeped in the lore of Mallory, you know, and he found no evidence that Mallory and Irvine had reached the summit. And I actually spoke to Peter Hillary. I interviewed him for the documentary, Edmund's son. Such a nice guy, a real gentleman. And he said, yeah, his father, you know, he adored him. Like, he thought he was a real hero to him. And there's a great quote from Edmund Hillary where he says, you know, I just think it's amazing. He said, when he actually climbed Mount Everest, he said, I was so surprised that I had gotten to the top of it, you know. He said, so many amazing people had gone before me, and here at the end of it all was old head Hillary, you know. So, you know, really encapsulates what a kind of a guy he was. There's no evidence really of them having got any higher than the first step. An oxygen cylinder was found in the 90s, and then in 99 there was an expedition that went out to look for Mallory's body, and they actually found it on the first day of searching. Now, they found kind of what you would call circumstantial evidence that they maybe had reached the top of the mountain. His snow goggles were in his pocket, so he must have been descending at night. And there's no picture, you know. The picture of his wife, Ruth, isn't in his pockets, you know. And then they take down the oxygen cylinder and a lot of the artifacts as well, or personal belongings belonging to Mallory, a lot of which are on display from time to time in the Royal Geographical Society. So I'll finish up now briefly. Yeah, just these are some of the locations here, all right? And I'll just show you a few quick picture after this, and then Sinead. The ice axe was found along here. An oxygen bottle was found along here. That oxygen bottle is the highest evidence that they've found of how high the guys got up. The first step is here. The second step is here, which is where O'Dell thinks that he saw them. And the third step, which is not meant to be as difficult as the second step, is here, and then up to the summit. Norton got as high as here. This is a great couloir. And Mallory's body was found in the snow basin here. So, you know, Reinhold Messner, who climbed this in the 80s without supplemental oxygen, said, well, that's the proof that they didn't make it, because that's where his body was found. Now, that, you know, again, it's what you consider proof, like, you know. So there's various theories that they may have got up there, they may not have. All very interesting. That's a picture there of the second step there. You can see the little ladder that was bolted in by the Chinese. So Mallory would have had to free climb that. Now, if you read Hingston's diaries, and any of the diaries, I've read Sandy Irvine's diaries in Merton College, they were, you know, frostbite, altitude sickness, severe headaches because they weren't hydrated properly, whatever you could have, you name it, they had it. You know, they were in severe, even like Hingston, who's a doctor, said these guys are in very bad shape to be heading up here for a third attempt. So you have all that. This is the couloir, by the way. Norton went up this way here, and that's the second step there to kind of avoid it and go up this way. And up you go. You know, Hingston's diaries said they were in severe shape, and then there's recent barometric data that there was a severe altitude drop in altitude. You know, so if the altitude level drops, you actually are up higher. Do you know what I mean? And there's that, and weather, and everything else. So, you know, there's speculation then that they mightn't have made it. On the other side, then there's people say that Mallory could have climbed it. I think Conrad Anker, the famous climber, climbed this. He free climbed it. A guy that I had in the documentary, Jason Black, has been up there as well. So it is possible to free climb that, although very difficult. I mean, the one thing Jason said to me, he said, like, climbing this at, like, you know, sea level, and I'm sure you'd be able to say, Frank, it's hard, like, it's a huge achievement to do this at sea level, like, you know, never mind up there, you know, so you have that all against you as well. And I'll just finish with this. I thought this was a kind of a fitting little thing that I saw. There's a memorial to them. There's various little memorials to Mallory and Irvine in various places. There's Mallory Court in Magdalen College. You know, Sandy Irvine, there's a memorial to him in the court in Merton College in Oxford. Sadly, nothing for Richard Hingston. He went back to Cork, and he was nearly really afraid to talk about all of this because he was in the British Army, so he just didn't really talk about it, you know. Odell and all the other guys went off and gave lectures, you know, and they spoke to packed out halls in Edinburgh, London, Leeds, you name it, you know. But he didn't really talk about it. Hingston, he died in the 60s, 66, very sad, you know, tragically, I suppose, he didn't get to talk about all his achievements in his life. So we tried to mark that last month in Cork. And then there's this memorial in Cheshire Cathedral, you know, to remember two valiant men of Cheshire, George Lee Mallory and Andrew Cumming Irvine, who amongst the snows of Everest adventured even unto death. So maybe someday it'll be solved, but it's interesting to think about what might have happened to them and if they made it. And I'll end on this. I think it was a quote that somebody came up with, which I thought kind of summed it all up. It said, "Everyone hopes that they made it except Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay." So there you go. All right, Sinead, thank you.